Imagine a tiny 50-mile strip of water that connects two of the world's biggest oceans. For centuries, this was just a dream, a wild engineering fantasy that promised to completely redraw the map of global power and trade. Well, this is the story of how that dream became, without a doubt, the most important 50 miles of water on the entire planet. So, before the shortcut existed, if you wanted to get a ship from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you had to take an 8,000-mile detour. That meant sailing all the way down and around the very bottom tip of South America. And look, this wasn't just a long trip, it was a complete gamble. You were battling the infamous Cape Horn, which meant violent storms, massive rogue waves, even icebergs. It was a brutal journey that could take weeks, burning up fuel, time, and all too often, costing lives. And that led to this one huge, powerful question that people obsessed over for centuries. What if? What if you could just slice right through that narrow little bit of land in Central America? What if you could connect the oceans and save all those thousands of miles? It was an idea that seemed to fly in the face of geography itself. The answer, of course, was the Panama Canal. This man-made river became the solution, an absolutely monumental feat of engineering that completely changed the way the world does business. And its impact, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. Today, that one narrow corridor handles 6% of all global maritime trade. Seriously, think about that. The car you drive, the coffee you drink, the device you're watching this on, there's a good chance it passed through here. The best way to think of it is like a giant man-made artery. For over 100 years, it has just been pumping goods and resources between continents non-stop. It's really the circulatory system for our entire global economy. But here's the thing, the story isn't over. Today, this century-old marvel, this symbol of human genius beating nature, is facing a threat that no one, and I mean no one, saw coming. A crisis that's threatening its very existence. So to really get what's happening now, we've got to go back and look at its incredibly dramatic past. See, the idea of a canal was old, but making it a reality, that turned out to be one of the deadliest and most difficult projects in all of human history. You know, the dream goes all the way back to Spanish explorers in 1513, but the first real attempt came in 1881. France, feeling pretty confident after building the Suez Canal, decided to take a crack at it, but they learned pretty quickly that the dense, disease-filled jungles of Panama were a whole different beast than the Egyptian desert. Their attempt ended in total, catastrophic failure. And the difference between that failure and eventual success really came down to strategy. The French tried to use brute force, just dig a massive trench at sea level right through the mountains. It was a disaster. Constant landslides and horrific outbreaks of yellow fever and malaria killed an estimated 22,000 workers. The Americans, when they took over, had a much smarter idea. The American plan was, frankly, revolutionary. They thought, why try to carve through the continent's rocky spine? Why not just lift the ships up and sail them right over the top of it? And that was the genius behind the lock and lake system. Okay, so here's how this magic trick works. A huge ship sails into a massive concrete box, a lock. The gates seal shut, and then millions of gallons of fresh water come rushing in from a lake, lifting the entire vessel 85 feet into the air. That's like an 8-story building. The ship then just cruises across a giant man-made lake before another set of locks gently lowers it back down to the ocean on the other side. It's basically a water elevator for some of the biggest ships in the world. Now, even with this brilliant system, the amount of digging they had to do was just insane. To create the main channel, called the Culebra Cut, workers had to blast and haul away over 200 million cubic yards of rock and dirt. That's enough stuff to build a wall from New York City all the way to San Francisco, twice. And then, finally, on August 15, 1914, the steamship SS Ancon made the very first official trip through the canal. Just like that, a journey that used to take weeks of life-threatening sailing was now done in about 8 hours. The impossible had been achieved. And once the canal was open for business, the impact was immediate. It was profound. It didn't just shorten a shipping route, it completely rewired the entire global economy. The numbers here really tell the story. That trip from New York to San Francisco, it got slashed from 13,000 miles down to just 5,200. That's a 60% drop. The savings in time and fuel were so massive, it opened up global trade in a way no one had ever seen before. Pretty quickly, the canal became something the world couldn't live without. Today, over 14,000 ships depend on it every single year. It's just this constant 24/7 parade of cargo moving in both directions. And the value of all that stuff? It's almost hard to believe. The cargo passing through the canal every year is worth around $1 trillion. It's become one of the most critical choke points in the supply chains that connect every single one of us. Our whole modern world is basically built on the assumption that the Panama Canal just works flawlessly all the time. But any problem there, any slowdown, it doesn't just mess up a few shipping schedules. The ripple effect causes price hikes and empty store shelves in cities thousands of miles away. Which brings us to the final and most critical chapter of this story. Because this masterpiece of engineering, this thing designed to conquer the laws of geography, it has a hidden flaw, an Achilles heel that now puts its entire future in question. You see, the very thing that makes the canal so brilliant is also the source of its greatest weakness. That incredible solution that lets ships go over the mountains, well, it created a dependency that the builders could never have dreamed would become a problem. And that vulnerability all comes down to one thing: fresh water. The whole lock system runs on it. For every single ship that passes through, millions of gallons of that fresh water are flushed out into the sea, gone forever. All of that water has to be replaced, and it comes from only one source, Gatun Lake, which is fed entirely by rain. But in our changing world, rainfall isn't a guarantee anymore. Long, severe droughts are hitting the region more and more often, and that's causing the water level in Gatun Lake to drop to crisis levels. And the equation is simple: no water means no canal. And that leaves us with a terrifying question for our time. The canal's builders beat mountains, jungles, and disease to create this thing, but they never planned for a world where it might not rain enough. So what happens to all of us when the great artery of global commerce starts to run dry? For over a century, the Panama Canal has been this incredible monument to human ingenuity. It's a testament to our power to literally reshape the planet, carving a path between oceans to fuel global trade. It was seen as a total victory of engineering over nature. It opened way back in 1914, and ever since, it's been so much more than just a waterway. It's been a powerful symbol of reliability. I mean, this 50-mile shortcut sliced 8,000 miles of shipping routes. It quickly became an absolutely indispensable artery for the world economy. Just stop and think about that for a second. 6% of all global maritime trade funnels through this one single choke point. The grain that feeds nations, the energy that powers our cities, a huge chunk of it flows right through here. So what happens if this titan of concrete and steel, this marvel of human will, comes up against a challenge it was never, ever designed for? A force it can't just conquer. Well, that's precisely what's happening. The Panama Canal is facing a genuine existential threat, and it's not from a rival nation or some economic collapse, but from the one resource that gives it life, its own water. Now, to really understand the depth of this crisis, we have to take a quick look at how this century-old marvel actually works, because its very genius is also, it turns out, its greatest vulnerability. It all comes down to the water. See, the heart of the entire operation is Gatun Lake. It's this massive artificial reservoir that was created by damming a river. It sits 85 feet above sea level, and that height, that's the whole key. The entire canal is powered by nothing more than gravity, using fresh water from this lake as its fuel. And the process is actually elegantly simple. A lock chamber fills up with water from the lake, which lifts a massive ship up. The ship sails into the next chamber, and so on. And then once the ship reaches the other side, all of that water is just drained out into the ocean. It's a one-way trip for the water. And here is the absolutely crucial point. Every single ship that passes through uses 52 million gallons of fresh water. To put that in perspective, that's enough to fill about 80 Olympic swimming pools, and all of that water is used just once before it's lost to the sea. The entire system was built on one single assumption: a constant, reliable resupply of rain. But that resupply has failed. Starting in 2023, Panama was hit by one of the worst droughts in its modern history, a problem supercharged by the El Niño climate pattern. The tropical rains that are supposed to feed Gatun Lake, well, they just didn't come. And you have to see just how razor thin the margin for error is here. Gatun Lake's normal level is right around 85 feet. During the drought, it dropped to nearly 79 feet. Now, 6 feet might not sound like a lot, but for the world's largest ships, it's absolutely catastrophic. It means they can't carry a full load. They have to literally shed cargo just to float high enough to get through. And that single fact created a problem that rippled out from Panama and started to affect the entire planet. The system had to slow way down, triggering a state of, you guessed it, global gridlock. The Canal Authority had no choice. They had to slash their capacity. On a normal day, about 38 ships can pass through the canal. During the worst of the drought, that number was cut to as low as 22. That is a stunning 40% reduction in traffic for one of the world's most critical trade routes. The result was an unprecedented traffic jam at sea. I mean, at the height of the crisis, you had more than 150 massive vessels just anchored at both ends of the canal, waiting in line for days, sometimes even weeks, just to get a spot to pass through. With slots so scarce, a frantic bidding war erupted. Companies desperate to skip the line started paying astronomical fees at auction. A normal transit fee is already about $400,000, but it skyrocketed. One vessel reportedly paid nearly $4 million. That's 10 times the normal rate for a single priority passage. And this is where that chain reaction really begins to affect all of us. Those incredible costs don't just disappear, they ripple outwards. That means manufacturing delays, higher prices for consumers, and huge bottlenecks for everything from American grain to critical energy shipments. The shockwaves were felt in every single corner of the global economy. So faced with this existential threat, Panama is now scrambling for solutions. But when your enemy is the climate itself, there are no easy answers. Right now, there are two main paths forward. One is to build more, construct massive multi-billion-dollar reservoirs to capture more rainwater when it does fall. The other is to use less. Retrofit the entire canal with modern water-saving basins that can actually recycle water for each transit. But both are monumental engineering projects that will cost billions and take years to complete. In the meantime, the industry is just trying to adapt. You have shipping lines rerouting around the entire continent of South America, which adds weeks and immense fuel costs to their journeys. Others are shifting to the Suez Canal or trying to use overland rail. But really, none of these options can truly replace the Panama Canal's unique geographic advantage. And that's exactly why this crisis is so much more than just a shipping story. It's a profound warning. It's a preview of a challenge that's facing all of us. Think about it. So much of our critical global infrastructure, our dams, our ports, our power grids, was all designed and built in the 20th century based on the assumption of a stable, predictable climate. And that core assumption is now broken. The Panama Canal is not some isolated case. We are seeing the exact same story play out everywhere, in California's strained water systems, in coastal cities threatened by rising seas, and in Arctic infrastructure that was built on what used to be solid frozen permafrost. The fundamental problem is the same. Our world was built for a planet that no longer exists. This single sentence just captures the dilemma perfectly. We are running 21st century systems on infrastructure that was designed with 20th century blueprints, and now the cracks are beginning to show. For 100 years, the story of the Panama Canal was one of humanity conquering nature, a triumph of human will over the wild. But its next chapter is going to have to be different. The question is no longer about conquest, it's about coexistence. Can this monument to human power finally learn to adapt to a planet that is powerfully and permanently fighting back?